Welcome everyone to our first Race Equality in Higher Education conference. We're absolutely delighted to see so many of you here today. And I'd now like to welcome to the stage the President and Vice-Chancellor of Queen's University, Professor Sir Ian Greer, to formally open today's conference. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lauren. It's really good to be here and to have the opportunity to welcome you in person to Queen's University Belfast. We're very pleased to have this conference. Indeed, it's our first conference dedicated to promoting race equality in higher education. And I should begin by offering a special thanks to our keynote speakers, Sheree Acheson. Sheree is a Queen's alumna, former Graduate of the Year, and a multi-award winning leader in global diversity, equity and inclusion. And Alfred Abolarin. Alfred is founder of Interact NI, of the African and Caribbean Support Organisation Northern Ireland, ACSONI, the Northern Ireland African and Caribbean Leadership Consortium, and the Migrant and Minority Ethnic Council. And I'd also like to welcome our external panel of speakers, Danielle Chavremutu, Richard Stewart, Michael Sulu, and Mary Hannon Fletcher. Really good to have you all here today. It's good to have you here because today is about sharing knowledge, sharing experience, and doing so making a real difference. And I hope that today's conference will evidence our firm commitment to equality and diversity and inclusion here at Queen's. It's hosted by Queen's Gender Initiative, which Karen leads, and which leads the Race Equality Charter programme at Queen's. QGI has got a remarkable history of success in this university. It really has been a flag bearer for equality issues, and it's good to see this development emanating from it. Throughout today's event, we'll feature a number of keynote speeches, some panel sessions, and we'll provide an opportunity for you to engage in meaningful discussion on racial equity on campus. So today's conference gives us a platform. It gives us a platform for the voice of our students, our staff, set in the context of our wider community within which we operate. Our students feature in the first panel session, entitled The Student Voice, when we'll hear from Femi, Manasa and Zara. They'll discuss the experiences that led them to become active in the racial equity space, so raising awareness of the initiatives that have been involved to support other students. Our speakers can provide real-world examples of the challenges facing organisations and individuals in addressing issues of race equality in higher education. And together today we can explore how barriers can be overcome and so co-create solutions focusing on three interrelated areas in higher education: diversifying education itself, the value of diversity across research and innovation, and the critical importance of partnerships in driving racial equity across universities. Queen's committed to the Advanced HE Race Equality Charter in 2020, and we're very proud to be one of more than 80 members. And this is in line with our university's strategy, Strategy 2030, and also our commitment to the UN SDGs. We take all of our commitments across civic engagement and social responsibility to our community in Northern Ireland very seriously indeed. I know that today will be the first of many more race equality events here at Queen's, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to welcome you in person. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Vice-Chancellor. And I would like to add my welcome to that of the Vice-Chancellor, and on behalf of the QGI REC team and of the organising committee, you are most welcome today. Equality has been a founding guiding principle in Queen's for more than a century, and it was embedded in our first charter, which aims to promote and to maintain equality of opportunity to all persons. As our EDI work has progressed over the years and been externally accredited through charters, we launched a new programme, the Racial Equity Programme, in 2020. And this aligned with work we had undertook in the previous year to interrogate our staff and student data, adopting intersectional approaches, and that was going to inform a new EDI programme. As the Vice-Chancellor said, Queen's then joined the Race Equality Charter, and you'll hear about that today from one of our panels. And that was prompted by staff and students who rightly raised the awareness of issues faced by individuals from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds. We established a new team to launch and to lead that racial equity programme, and we drew on EDI expertise, methodology and practices. What's been really important is the new Champions Network. We have a very active and highly motivated REC Champions Network, many of whom are in the room today, and they represent all areas of Queen's. And a subgroup of that network, along with the REC team, formed the organising committee for today's conference, and we thank the champions and the committee for all of their work and dedication in making today happen. So what have we done so far in the programme we launched 3 years ago? Well, phase 1, we started really with a consultation on language and terminology, and that was followed by a reverse mentoring programme that has been so well received. The REC EDI 5 action programme was launched during Race Equality Week earlier this year. That incorporates active bystander training, the review of the curricula, mentoring and developing collaborative approaches to understand and to address problems. And a key objective has been to amplify the visibility and the voice of colleagues and students from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds through podcasts, videos and events. And please do check Queen's YouTube channel for narratives from our community that are thought-provoking, challenging and inspiring in equal measure. I highly recommend the podcast series. The university is more diverse than the Northern Ireland population, and we'll hear more about that from today's speakers, our keynotes and our panellists. The Northern Ireland census in 2021 indicates that less than 4% of the population identify as Black, Asian, minority ethnic. That's double from the previous census 10 years earlier and double from the 2001 census. In the university, our student population is 18%, that's higher for postgrad taught, and our staff population, particularly academics and researchers, are much more diverse than the Northern Ireland community. So we have a responsibility. It's imperative that Queen's and our universities ensure that their culture, their structures and practices are welcoming, enabling and inclusive for everyone. Our university needs to identify and address challenges faced by underrepresented groups, ensuring equity so that everyone can reach their potential. So today's conference is a really important milestone for us. Thank you most sincerely for choosing to spend this day with us, learning, sharing, reflecting, and co-creating solutions as partners. Thank you most sincerely for that. And it's now my pleasure to invite one of our students, Jamie Lucas-Campbell, to come to the podium and to introduce our keynote speaker for this morning. Thank you, Jamie Lucas.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Queen's first conference dedicated to our commitment to pursuing race equality on campus, in our communities, and through the impact of our research. I'm delighted to be here today with you all, and I must thank Lauren and the QGI team for inviting me to introduce one of our keynote speakers for the day. I had the privilege of serving as a race equality champion last year, and I'm so proud of the work that so many of that network achieved in getting us all here into this room today. And I'm grateful to each and every one of you. The keynote speaker I have the honor of introducing today is someone who I admire. She's a global tech and business leader and an accomplished author whose work champions diversity and inclusion as essential ingredients in business and in public service. And I'm elated that we will have an opportunity to hear her speak about agility in this space. I'm excited to take today's learnings into action. But before I introduce her, I want to share a bit of my own experience and how I first became familiar with EDI work and what it means to be a champion for EDI in the workplace. Growing up, I was a vocal advocate for high-quality public education for all. I grew up in a low-income and single-parent household after my parents divorced, and I was committed, despite the adversity, to championing a better city with people who looked like me, where we were included and present at the table. I fought to become the first student vice president of the Parent-Teacher Association, the first time a student was ever elected to the post in the state of New York. It was at Saunders High School in Yonkers and a very small community just north of the Bronx. There I met an elderly gentleman who gifted me with a book called Open the Unusual Door. That book helped change my life. It was his kind gesture and, of course, the book that helped how I understand allyship and what that actually means. Fast forward about 15 or so years here at Queen's, I met an incredible academic, one of the most talented and gifted people I ever met in 2021. They were from the Global South. They pulled me aside one morning and gave me a book that set me on track for my PhD, where I studied the impact of exclusionary policies on marginalized people. Namely, the impact of exclusionary policies of the US military on Black queer service members and what compels us to stay. As a former service member, albeit one who quit, I have long pondered why there were so few women, individuals of color, and gender nonconforming individuals in positions of military influence. So that's what I explore in my work here at Queen's. I spent years working alongside national security experts. I've met and worked alongside heads of state and their representatives. I've served as a representative for the White House in rooms that either seldom or never saw people who looked like me. I've communicated with staff in the Situation Room on countless occasions. But the ethnically diverse staff and the service members, the women, the gender nonconforming, and the queer people in those spaces are far and few in between, even today. And we fight through today to be included. But I've never turned away from a fight. And my battle cry to you all today is to speak loudly, amplify the voices of those not often heard. Passive allyship and moderation does not turn the tides of history. The Queen's I want to see is one that this Vice Chancellor and some of the individuals I've met here are actively championing. It is one that is truly inclusive, truly international, truly welcoming, authentically and unapologetically anti-racist. It's a campus where decolonization is not a buzzword we lecture to our students, but it is a practice. And one in which a students' union is not seen as a rubber stamp, but an organization for vocal and proactive student voice, because a representative student body is what we need to deliver on the impact of the promise of all of our work. For those staff members in the room committed to this work, I say, trim the bureaucracy. Empower your colleagues to act. Recognize the diaspora of the international student, postdoctoral, and professional services communities here at Queen's. Ask your ethnically diverse staff and students what they need. Seek our feedback continuously and safely without consequence. Ignore the naysayers who say that EDI work is divisive. Recognize that it is indeed the opposite. Our work is a function of bringing all of us together. Let us not allow our work championing race equality and EDI to be diminished or trivialized. Let us support one another. Let us be vocal. Our Race Equality Charter Group here can and must be louder and speak more directly to the bread and butter of our university, the students and the communities from which we all come. Our research demands it. Our commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals demands it. The communities and environments to which we are sending our students demands it. We'll hear from some of that, you will hear some of that from our fabulous speaker, whose work in EDI has earned her the ranking as one of the UK's top most influential women in tech, and numerous awards for your global services to diversity and inclusion. You're a champion, she's a champion, and a leader that you have undoubtedly heard of here at Queen's before. And she also happens to be one of Queen's very own. Please take out your notepads and pens and let's sit back for this masterclass that we can take into practice tomorrow. I cannot tell you how much this conference means to our students and staff of color on campus, so before I leave, I have to say a huge thank you to everyone planning it, involved, and being here today, and just sharing and exchanging ideas and feedback. And so everyone, please welcome to the podium one of Queen's own, Sheree Acheson.
Oh, perfect, thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction, amazing. And thank you everybody to joining us here today. It's really great to be here, really great to be back home for a visit as well. I don't have to change my accent when I speak back home, which is nice because you'll all understand me. Maybe the slides won't understand me though. Let's see how this is going to go. There we go, perfect. I have been doing senior diversity and inclusion leadership for over 13 years. I help companies, particularly in the tech industry, to create inclusive and accessible technologies And I spend a lot of time with leaders helping them understand how to create unbiased decisions through embedding friction into decision making. At the most basic level, my job is getting people to slow down. Today I'm going to talk about some of my own journey. I think especially growing up in the north of Ireland and being a person of colour here in the 90s has been in a uniquely experience, a nuanced experience, certainly for me and for I know a lot of other people, certainly with the lens of religion that's incredibly integrated into how we live here in the north of Ireland. We cannot ignore that conversation with the race lens on top of that. I'm a global diversity and inclusion executive. I've held senior leadership roles at a lot of different companies like Deloitte, like Monzo Bank, and I'm now at an agency called Valtech. And I sit on the board of the world's largest non-profit globally dedicated to women in technology called Women Who Code, where we have over 330,000 global members as well. We have a place here in Belfast, which is where I started our Women Who Code UK expansion 7 years ago now, I think. Feels like a long time ago, back when I had just graduated from Queen's as a computer scientist and a software engineer. And I write a lot, probably too much, but I think it's important to share what's worth up here outside of my own head. I write a lot for Forbes, for Thomson Reuters, for the Evening Standard, and a whole host of other publications, really focusing on using data as the way to unearth privilege and change the trajectory that we are on. I'm going to share a bit about my own background today in the hope that maybe it helps you take some time to think about your own background and also the background of people both like you and not like you. The key one probably being that second part as well, some awareness maybe outside of what you're used to too. And then I want to share with you, I guess, actions that we can take forward. So I think it's really important to always take a step back. I think with diversity and inclusion work, we very often try to move forward with, there's a problem here, let's try and fix it. But actually, why is that problem there? Why are we trying to do this? I think it's really important when we try to fix a problem that we do discovery work. In the same way, when you work with different clients, when you're researching something new, you spend so much time understanding the previous before moving forward to the future. So let's take a step back for me, and this is my journey, I guess, firstly, of being a person of colour here in Ireland and growing up in the 90s, which is very, very different to the Ireland I know now, which is certainly much more diverse. And Karen, you alluded to that with the diversity you have here at the university. I describe myself as underrepresented yet privileged. I am a multi-award-winning leader. I've spoken at the Nobel Peace Conference, I've spoken at Davos, I've spoken at all of these conferences that people like me don't tend to speak at, but there's an immense amount of privilege in that. There's also an immense amount of being underrepresented as well, but there's a balancing act here, and I really want us to delve into the balancing act, that this isn't simply 1 or 0, but actually there's a lot of grey areas in between. So if I take a step back, that went too fast. As you may notice, obviously from here because of my accent, but I don't tend to look like most people that are from here. And that's because I was adopted from Sri Lanka when I was 3 weeks old by a white working class Irish family from County Tyrone. Now that feels like quite a long time ago. That was in 1991 when I was 3 weeks old. The slides are lagging. What is going on? There we go. And this is my dad with my biological birth mother and my brother's biological birth mother as well in 1991 in February. Now there's a lot of privilege in my story, and there's also a lot of marginalization as well. Like I said, I grew up in the 90s. I was taken or adopted and brought to County Tyrone, to a very small town called Coal Island, if anybody knows it. Maybe we have some people here today that are from Coal Island. And in the 90s, there was not a lot of diversity, certainly in County Tyrone and certainly in Coal Island, to the extent that people used to come to our house to see us because they'd never seen people of colour outside of the TV. Now, when we think about experiences like that, when you get used to understanding actually what it means to grow up in a space where you're the only, many of you will have had experiences being the only, whether that's in your boardroom, which I also recognise, in your teams, in your research teams and so on. But what I really want you to think of is about being the only in your family, in your extended family, in your friend group, when you go to school, when you go to secondary school, for example, when you move through life where you are continuously obvious. And in a way that some people feel like, well, it's great to stand out, it's great to have that ability to do that. Recognise that there has to be an element of confidence and security to make that a confidence piece and not something that feels othering. Now, certainly growing up in the north of Ireland and going to primary school and going to a predominantly Irish Catholic school as well, in the area that I grew up, people were not wealthy. My family ended up on disability benefits. I grew up on free school meals, which is a state-provided benefit, as you know, for families that can't afford to feed their kids when they're at school. I am acutely aware of the different layers of underrepresentation that people can have, both from my own experience, but also from the experiences that I don't have from listening, which is what I guess a lot of you are doing here today. I think it's really important that we listen to things that maybe challenge us. Because we don't identify with them, that simply doesn't mean that they don't exist. It means it's a different avenue for many of us. Perfect. And when we went to school, I think it's really important. I know it used to be really, really cute. I don't really know what happened. And my brother hates this picture because some of his teeth are starting to come out and he remembers what that was like. But when we grew up in school, when we were this cute kids, you know, we're really young, everybody thinks it's adorable, you don't face a lot of racism. You don't face, certainly I didn't face a lot of racism at that stage of my life because we were adorable. It was a cute story. Look at these brown babies that are now here from this other place all across the other side of the world. But when you start to get older, when things start to change, when you start to become a teenager, that's when people's views started to really, really change for us. Now, you can't tell in that picture because it's black and white, but my brother is significantly darker than me as well, and he faced significantly more racism than I faced growing up because he was much darker. Also because he was growing up as a young teenage boy, and of course boys can be much more aggressive, typically in a way that girls are not. So we faced quite a lot of racism growing up. We got called a lot of words like the N-word, the P-word, and so on. My brother used to have to walk home a different way from school because a neighbouring school would have hurled abuse at him. And again, when he's also with young teenage friends, there's not much they can do either. Again, albeit all of them were white, so they're not facing the same experiences that he is experiencing. I think it's really important when we think about different experiences that we recognise that many of us, if I was to write down on a page that, you know, I grew up in a working class Irish Catholic family in the north of Ireland, relatively poor and certainly underprivileged in that way, many of you would have similar experiences with those different lenses. But I think when you put the lens of race on top of all of this, it's so important to recognise the nuance that that brings to a country like this, a country that has been fraught with war, with division in so many ways. And then we also then start to look at how we can people are dividing people further when we start to talk about race. I think what's so important for me is, you know, going to secondary school, certainly figuring out who I was as a person, which is complicated, it's not easy. And I certainly went back to my school in Dungannon, which has been a really proud moment. One of the things when I look back at school was I was academically very bright, but everything was really difficult. I had to fight a lot harder for access to opportunities. And we're going to talk about what we mean by that in a minute. But I think it's so important when we think about people's journeys that we recognise that, let's say we're all peers here today, there are so many different journeys, steps forward, steps back, that each of us will have taken. I know for me, one of my real defining moments that I remember when I went to secondary school on the first day, when I was on free school meals, and back then it was way before you had you know, cards and stuff that people don't know who's paying for what, but anybody who was on free school meals was given a pink ticket, and anybody who wasn't on free school meals was given a blue ticket. And there was 3 or 4 people in my school, in my class, that had the pink ticket. And it's this moment where you just feel like everybody's eyes are on you. You understand what that difference is like. And even though nobody's saying something, you're acutely aware of what that means. You're acutely aware when you hand that over that you know you're having a different experience to everybody else. And that's what's really important here today, that we recognise that there is different experiences. Now, I'm very lucky to have went to Queen's University. I was the first Acheson in my family to ever go to university because, one, I worked incredibly hard, but I had to be the best in my class in secondary school to get access to grants that I was able to then get, access to loans and so on, to come to Queen's, to go to university, to study computer science. That was something that wasn't possible for anybody else in my family. And actually now what's wonderful is I've also had cousins now that have also went to study computer science and have just graduated and so on as well. So it's spurred a movement within the Acheson household. And that's something I'm really, really proud of, to be able to have, what's that word, I guess, step forward in a way that I have been given access to opportunities. When I look at my story, there's a lot of privilege in there, okay? I was adopted at 3 weeks old. That's a privilege. I'm very, very lucky that I was put up for adoption. I have a half-sister and a half-brother in Sri Lanka. Their journeys are obviously incredibly different to mine. And it just happened to be that my birth mother wasn't able to provide for me. She was in extreme poverty. She had me out of wedlock, which in Sri Lanka, certainly a very religious country, and again with the lens of poverty, was not something she was able to support me. She wasn't able to keep me. But that has given me a lot of access to opportunities. Yes, I had to grow up on free school meals, but that benefit existed here for me to have. Yes, I had to work incredibly hard at school to get access to grants and bursaries to come to university, but those processes existed, and that's a privilege that I've been able to access that. But I think what's so important is that we recognise that access to opportunity is the key thing here. Opportunities exist for everybody, okay? We can all see that opportunity is everywhere, but if I can't access it, it might as well not be there. It might as well be in another country. It might as well be in another language. It might as well not be there for me, even if it is there for other people. Now, I have a photo, that's the one that's coming up, and it's on the quad, and I actually only got to see it today on the quad, was when I was Queen's Grad of the Year in 2019. Now, I've won a load of awards. I have an awards cabinet, which I'm very proud of. Needs dusted a lot, though, which I don't like so much. But of all the awards that I've won all around the world and all of the notoriety and everything else, for me, winning the award at Queen's, and Dr. Gift, who also won Student of the Year that year as well, together, was such an incredibly poignant moment in my career. Firstly, coming back to Ireland to win something that, you know, I've seen those awards for years. I've seen all of the different people that won them. I've also seen that nobody that looked like me had ever won it before me either. And that was something that was so important to me. But also the recognition that the work that I do is so important to a place and an institution like this. I think that influence is key, that voice is key, and that's one of my proudest moments. And I went to the quad just before this to get a photo beside it, because people send me photos of it all the time, but I've never actually got to see it myself. But I remember speaking and getting that photo taken here, and speaking here at a podium as well a few years ago, and it was such a great moment. My family was here, the hall was full. It was such an amazing moment in my career, but a really, really important one for race equality and race conversations in the north of Ireland, and certainly here at Queen's. And I think when we move through these conversations, you know, I live in England now, I spend most of my time in other places in the world, but when we come back here, I think it's really key that we recognise what we're talking about. And we're talking about different layers. We're not talking about ones and zeros. We're talking about very unique and nuanced experiences. Now, everybody's experience is different, regardless of what lens we're talking about. No two people in this audience will have had the same journey, even if you have had arguably similar upbringings. But what I think is key when we talk about this is that we recognise that there are so many differing experiences, so wildly differing, that if we don't listen to them, we never learn and we never change. I'm married to a white Irish man who's from Ballygolly, which isn't too far away from Coal Island. He is at a very similar upbringing in that he's also not from a wealthy background. His family are farmers and so on, but he's obviously white. So it's a very different experience when we talk about how we grew up. Even though there's those lenses of similarity because of our socioeconomic background, because of growing up in a white working class Catholic area, there's a huge differing point where we get to a point where it's like, he has no experience of that. He talks to my brother and arguably they're close in age, but the differences are wildly, completely different. When you start to think about bullying, when you start to think of those formative years where you're figuring out who you are as a person, some of us are still figuring ourselves out, that we get to a point where it's actually very, very different. Now, I talk about my balance of being underrepresented and privileged, and I think one of the biggest privileges I have is that I'm listened to. Ironically, as you sit and listen to me for 40 minutes and then ask questions for 20. But I think what's key here is I have an avenue, and that's why I do a lot of this work, and I keep doing this work. I've been featured in most of the world's biggest publications. I've written 2 books, and I have been lucky enough to be listened to. And what I would ask you to do is, as you move out of this hall, as you go for the break and you listen to the panels throughout the day, that you don't forget about this, that you also forget about the avenues that you have access to, that many people will not have access to, that the voices that you can amplify, or even just the discussions that you can have, are so important. Now, what I think we always have to talk about here is equity, and we've kind of touched on it quite a lot as we go on, but actually, why should we care? You know, why are we here? Why are you sitting here today? Hopefully not just for free breakfast, but why are you here? Why have you decided to come here? And I'd like for you to take a second to think about that. But what we're here to do is to re-level a playing field. Now, this is my favourite. There's lots of versions of this diagram, but this is my favourite one. I always use this one. What I said at the start was that we are talking about access to opportunity. Now, on the right-hand side, we have a tree. There's some fruit on that tree. One person has some access to fruit. They can see it. They know they can reach some of it. The other person has less access. They can see some opportunity up there, but they actually can't reach it. So, what's the purpose here? We're in inequality. There's access problems here. There's opportunity here. But one person can access some, one person can't access any. Now, when we take a point of equality, when we're trying to move everyone forward together, what we're potentially doing is losing the nuance here. Now, think of this again from the north of Ireland. We talk about religion quite a lot here. We talk about socioeconomic background, and we're now talking about race quite a lot. Think about all of those lenses together. You put these things together. People don't exist in separate boxes. We exist as one whole person. When we don't understand the nuances and the differences that people have, and the different experiences or the lack of access to opportunity, what we end up doing is things like equality, where we give everybody the same support with the assumption that that moves everybody forward. Now, in this scenario, great, the person on the left can now access all of that opportunity. They have all the food they need. But the other person might as well still be 6 miles away. It doesn't matter that they're actually closer. They're still not getting access to that opportunity. And when we talk about equity, and I know this is what we're talking about here today, is about really understanding the differences, the different access to opportunities, and how we trajectorily change those things, is that we're starting to recognize the different experiences, the different access points, financial backgrounds, and how that influences where we go and how we get there, and how we stay there as well, understanding that financial stability will change your ability to take risks, and so on. When we start to recognize those differences, then we're starting to understand that me moving and me helping someone else that needs more support is not taking away from somebody else, but is actually recognizing that we're re-leveling. That other person can still access the fruit that they needed to at the very beginning, and now the other person can access, even though it's much less opportunity, they can still access something. Now, I always say, in a great world we would have justice, but I'll be honest, the world's a bit messed up and we don't have the control to change the world. What I really get companies to focus on is equity, because what we can control is our hiring processes, our promotion processes, our grievance processes, what we deem as good enough and not good enough, and interrogate that with the lens of race, ethnicity, gender, economic background, and so on and so forth. So I always focus on equity because, I'll be honest, I don't think justice is something we're going to get anytime soon, because we can't focus what happens outside these walls inside. I'm going to take this off, it's actually very warm now. But what I think is really, really important when we have those conversations is that we really think about what we have within our control. What do you have within your control? Some of you might be students, some of you might be faculty, some of you might be people from other spaces that are interested in what we're having today. Everybody has a realm of control. It doesn't have to be like me writing for Forbes, but you have a family. No, you have friends, you have people you can talk to about this. Remember that influence has such a huge knock-on effect. When my publisher reached out to me to write demanding more, firstly I said no, and then I said yes because my husband was like, don't turn down good opportunities. And I signed that book deal at the start of February 2020. Then a pandemic happened and I had to write it in a flat in London in 6 months, which wasn't great. But I said yes to writing that because I wanted to write something that everybody could get something from. My dad, who was a sort of mid-70s-year-old white Irish man with disability issues from a poorer background, not really a great concept on understanding of race outside of the fact he knew he had to fight a lot for us growing up and push back against a lot of bullies and other parents and so on. But I wrote that for him so as people, regardless of whether you were in industry, regardless of what level you were at, whatever you were doing, you could get some understanding of how to do things better. And that's ultimately what we're trying to get to here. Some things will be more relevant for other people than maybe some of you, and vice versa. But I think what's key is that we all take away something, that we move forward with purpose. Now, when we talk about the lens of the university and the fact that you have much more diversity here than what you have outside of these four walls, what I think is key to recognise is how we invite people in. What is it that we're doing that's different inside these walls that's not quite happening outside? Now, I'll be honest, there is a lot of division in the north of Ireland, okay? We know that. It's certainly better than what it was, but there's still a way to go. And I think we can't discount that when we start to think about the lens of race equality as well. Some people will try and separate these two things, but I don't think that's possible. It's so ingrained into how we are as people, and certainly ingrained into how we are as people as we move forward from that time. But I think when we start to bring in the different types of diversity that we now have, that we didn't necessarily have 20, 30, 40 years ago in the same way, we have to make sure we don't make the same mistakes that we have made in the past, that leaders, politicians have made in the past, and been happy to do so as well. Karen has already touched on this, but I think it's key when we look at data. I think we should always benchmark our conversations against data. One of my biggest bugbears is when we try to have conversations around the world from let's say, a North America lens to the rest of the world, and vice versa, because these conversations are so different everywhere. Race conversations are not the same in any country or any city for that matter. The company I work for at the moment is in 65 different entities. So the conversations we have on race equality in North Macedonia or Ukraine is very different to the ones we have in our New York offices or our Brazilian offices or our India offices, where it's all very, very nuanced. But what I would say to you is when we think about race equality here in the north of Ireland, that we recognise that things are getting more and more diverse. I know when I go back to Tyrone now, and back to Cull Island, I see many, many more different brown and black faces walking around the town that was not there before. It was very obvious whenever me and my brother were in that town who we belonged to, who our parents were, and so on. Whereas now it's not the same as that, and there's a lot more interracial relationships and so on. Again, I'm in one of those. Still an anomaly in many spaces, but there's a lot of change. And I would like you to think about what these statistics will continue to look like. Certainly when you look at the university, at how we bring in different people, because one, we know when we are doing research, when we are creating solutions of tomorrow, we cannot do that in an echo chamber. An echo chamber does not allow us to create the best solutions or the most money in the future, because our client base, our customers, society is not monolithic. People do not exist in one fell swoop, but we have all of these different groups, these different needs that we have to answer to. And that's why when we look at the diversity that university has, we can see that it's significantly different. Now, of course, there's always more that we can do, and there's more that we have to do, but I think with that knowledge that we are reaching people already from all of these different backgrounds, that there's something in that, something is drawing people to here. But how do we make sure that we draw them to the university? Great, but actually, do they stay in this country after? Do they stay here when they finish, or do they leave? Do they go somewhere else because of the lack of diversity? Do they decide that actually, maybe this isn't the place for me because of it potentially being exclusionary outside of these four walls? Now, I think when we think about the diversity of what we want here, we want diversity of perspective. We want all different perspectives, nuanced ideas, and so on the same problem or solution. We don't want to have the same ideas on the one solution, because then we don't answer the questions that people want before they've asked them. If you think about how politicians work, you answer a question before somebody thinks about it, because then they can't ask it to you in a way that you don't want to answer it. And I know I do that as well. I learned something from them. Well, that's probably about it. But I think what's really important is that we recognize that when we're creating solutions, when we're working in research in particular, we're not looking at things that are finite just to us. It's so, so broad, and it can be even broader if we push ourselves outside of our boundaries. Now, I would ask you, as we sit here today, when we talk about privilege, what we're talking about is a set of unearned benefits. There's no skill to being privileged, and it's an advantage or immunity granted to a particular person or group. Now, in my story, certainly when I talk about the privileges that I have, of being adopted, of having access to opportunity, of having food each night, of having access to healthcare as I've needed it, certainly now as someone who will create or has created generational wealth in my family that has never existed before, I have an ability to have that balance of privilege while still traversing spaces that most people like me are not in. I think when we think about that, what I would ask you to do is think about the privileges that you may have. One of the things I read about or have written about a lot in my book is the privileges of names. So my name is Sheree Acheson, and you'll see in the corner my Twitter handle, for example, is @Nirashika. And Nirashika is my Sri Lankan name that my birth mother gave me, and my family decided to keep that as my middle name. Now, they very nearly called me Nirashika Acheson. Now, for obvious reasons, you can imagine the bias that would have caused, certainly in my career, earlier in my career when I'm applying for jobs as an engineer, what that would have meant. Now, I have the privilege, certainly maybe not now, but earlier in my career, of the anonymity of a Western Irish name. Because you see Sheree Acheson, who lives in Dungannon, who went to Queen's University, you would probably assume I'm a white Irish woman. So I don't face the same bias as potentially other Sri Lankan women, for example, who have Sri Lankan names. And I think when we talk about privilege, we have to recognise that there's so many bits and pieces to this. And this isn't about people feeling bad. If you feel bad about this, there's a lack of awareness as to why that exists then, and it's not my problem either. I think what's really key is when we think about awareness, sometimes awareness is shocking to the system. I know when I've been back to Sri Lanka, I've found my biological birth mother and so on. I've been on that journey to see actually what is her life like. What would my life have been like? And obviously it was completely worlds away from what I do now and the financial stability and so on that I have. But there's moments in that journey for me where I've had to take stock and just be like, wow, there's a lot of privilege here. My name, in some ways my accent, certainly when I started to work across in England, I faced a lot of bias for my accent. The assumption that people with accents like ours are unintelligent. The assumption that if you go and study in Ireland instead of in England, that your degree is somehow worth less because of, again, the social bias towards particularly London-centric universities and accents as well. But the flip side of that is when I've been at universities here, or when I've been applying to jobs when I was an engineer, on the phone, my accent sounds like everybody else's. Nobody can tell anything. And I think when we think about the nuance here, that's important to recognise that, ones and zeros can be zeros and ones. Everything can flip. Context is so important here. And what I would ask you is, when you think about yourself, are you privileged? I think the answer is probably yes, but I would really like you to think about why that is. I'd also like you to think about what you can do with that. Nobody is perfect. I am certainly not perfect. Shocking, I know, but I am definitely not perfect. And I think what's really important about that is recognizing that we will make mistakes. I make mistakes all of the time. I stumble, I can use the wrong words, I'm figuring things out as much as anybody else. But listening is so important for this. When we don't listen, we shut ourselves off. What I would ask you to think about is how you listen to certain groups of people. Now, do you listen, as in do you wait for people to finish what they're saying, digest it for a few seconds and provide a response, or are you simply waiting for your turn to speak? And if you do that, I would ask you, what lens of people do you do that with? Now, a lot of the work I do is with senior leadership teams, with executives, managing directors, and so on. The majority of people in that group are from monolithic groups, which is typically white folks, men, straight folks, and the combination of those different things. Now, if we, for example, primarily listen to that group in that real, genuine, active way, we tend to then create an association that that group is the most important group, the best group to listen to, the most worthy of listening to. If all of the other folks, or the majority of the other folks from different backgrounds, are outside of that group, we've then automatically created a bias in our heads that we will listen to this group properly and actively, and we will simply wait for our turn to speak for these other groups. Now, what that ends up doing is we work in an echo chamber. We cut out perspectives, we cut out ideas, we cut out ways of learning. And what I would ask you is, when you think about this, what we're talking about is belonging. Now, diversity and inclusion, people use it too much as a buzzword. I think we really have to talk about here is embracing diversity separately and fostering inclusion separately. Two very different business strategies as well. One's about representation, and one's really about employee engagement, how people feel, how our processes work. Do we interrogate them with data to see actually do they work, as opposed to assumption? I would ask you what belonging means to you. Now, for me, belonging means that I know that when I speak, I'm listened to and my insights are actioned. I know that when I share something, even if it's not the right thing or the right idea, that people will listen and bounce back off of that onto me. They won't just make an assumption that because it's coming from my mouth, it's immediately wrong or not worthy of listening to. I wonder what that means for you. Take a second just to think, actually, what does belonging mean for you? Why do you want a sense of belonging? Are there moments in your life, not even necessarily career, but in your life where you feel that sense of, actually, I belong here. I feel like I have a purpose here. I have people around me that help me reach whatever my goals are, whether that's within your family, within your friends, within your work, and so on. Because belonging is so nuanced. Now, remember again when I said at the start about the nuance here of underrepresentation of race in the north of Ireland. When we think about belonging there with that small group, that small percentage, that yes, it's getting bigger. I want you to think about, if you have that experience, or if you don't have that experience, what that's like for different groups of people who maybe don't have the given belonging because they are different. I certainly remember that growing up. I certainly still remember that, and whilst it doesn't necessarily faze me now, it's something I'm acutely aware of. When me and my partner moved to Belfast, went to university, of course, and so on, moved to London, I remember the first moment of going into the big Tesco in Streatham where we lived, and there was so many interracial couples, and I was like, Sean, nobody's looking at us anymore, we're not special now. Whereas when I was in Castlereagh in Belfast, people were looking at us, and people would make comments. I'd go back in Tyrone and we would get people sort of watching and not really understanding so much. And then we moved to Kent, which is kind of like Ireland, but sunny and has good wine. But it's very undiverse as well. And now we're back in an experience where when we go into different places, I will be the only, for the most part, brown person in that room. When we go into different environments, I can feel eyes on me. And people might be like, well, that's a good thing. That's because of this. It's because of that. I can still feel eyes on me, and I don't necessarily like it. That's an experience I don't have to have in London, which is a very diverse place. And I want you to think about, if you don't have that experience here, for example, what it's like for people that do, what it's like to have to quantify yourself and so on. You know, I know if I didn't have the accent that I have, my experience growing up here would have been even more different than what it is with my very thick Tyrone accent. When I think about fostering belonging, I think there's lots of different things we can do, and I want to go through these, and then we'll go to some questions, hopefully, that you have. If not, we will pick on people, because we don't like silence. And what I would ask you to do is to remember how privilege really manifests in processes and ways of working. It's very easy to say, you know, this group is privileged, this group is not, etc., etc. But what I want you to think about is how that influences who we give funds to, for example, how that influences who we deem to be worthy of mentorship or sponsorship if it's informal. How do we decide who we want to hire, and why do we do that? When we've created processes, typically they've been created with the majority in mind, because for obvious reasons the majority demographic folks have created those, the processes work for them, it works for the majority of folks. Then we start to get outliers, people from different backgrounds, where that process has not been tested for those people. That process has not been interrogated with those different lenses, those different avenues of access to opportunity. And what's really important is what a lot of organisations are doing now is interrogating that process in a different way that they've never done before. You will find things that you won't like when you do that, but if we don't do that, then we can't change anything. Awareness is one thing, but action is a completely different thing. I think we have to also really recognise that when we do this work, we're doing it together. Better and more diverse organisations benefit everybody. I think one of the things whenever I talk to a lot of organisations, and you get pushback from people, of course, there's always pushback from people. There's a lack of recognition that when we have better flexibility, when we have more collaborative cultures, everybody works better together because there's more ideas in the room. People are heard in different ways. I also think there's a lens of accessibility that's so often forgotten about in diversity and inclusion work. And what I mean when I'm talking about accessibility, I'm really talking about physical accessibility and also digital accessibility as well. A lot of the companies I work with create the solutions of tomorrow, and retrospectively will try and shoehorn accessibility in without recognising that it's such a privilege that we can all use different bits and pieces in a way that other people cannot. And that's a really big privilege. I know for me personally, my hands don't really work very well, so I was worried whenever I came here, it was going to give me a hand mic that I couldn't really hold. But it's a big privilege then that many people can do those things, whereas my hands don't really function the way they're supposed to. what I would ask you to do is to remember those different and unique experiences that have brought people to where they are right now. One of the exercises I do, and it's in my book, Demanding More, is a privilege walk, where I ask everybody, I think it's like 50 or 60 questions, and depending on your answer, you'll step forward, you'll step back, whatever it might be. Questions around accessibility, neurodiversity, race, gender, sexual orientation, and so on. And what you end up is typically with a scatter graph of people. People all the way forward, some all the way back, some still in the middle. But the key point of that is that these people, we typically do that with peer groups. So they're all at similar level, whether that's vice president, VP, senior VP, whatever it might be. So they're peer groups, they work with each other every single day, but there's never a recognition that actually, yes, we've all got to this point, but getting to that point has been so varied and so different for every single person in that room. And those different experiences is so important that we do that. And I would urge you to do that. I think I've open sourced that training as well. If you Google my name, you'll find it. But what I would say is so important, one of the biggest skills that any leader I think can have, or any person, is being considerate and empathetic. I think it's really easy to get defensive when we have these conversations. It's very easy to have an immediate reaction, well, I don't have that experience, so therefore it's not accurate. Or that person didn't mean that, but they're nice to me, without recognizing that nice is subjective. What I think is nice and what you think is nice are probably not the same thing. I think what's so important is that we recognize that different experiences will be very different to you, and sometimes they'll be less different. But that doesn't mean that that's an avenue to be defensive, to immediately go on the back foot, but to actually just take a moment, take a second to listen, take a second to digest what that person's saying, recognizing that it's probably been quite difficult for them to share. And I know you're going to listen to some panels today. I'm sure there will be things that will be shared, and that will probably be quite difficult for those people. What I would ask you to do is really sit, bubble on that, and really learn from it. Be very lucky that someone is willing to share that with you to help you grow as well. And what I would say, and I think this is important for everybody, is about challenging yourself on your own bias. We hear a lot, and I know I've talked about religion sort of every so often here, but I think when we think about the bias that we have, and I'll use my own background again, growing up, working class, Irish, in a Catholic household, there's a lot of bias that was put into certainly me and my brother as we grew up in Cull Island, as you can probably imagine. And I'm sure again, I'm sure most people here have watched Derry Girls, where they have, the Across the Barricades session where you go to, trips with the Protestant community, for example. And I remember doing that, where we had to go on school trips together with the Protestant community or the other schools across the road to try and learn about what these other people were like, without the recognition that they're almost exactly the same. There's no real difference here. But when we challenge ourselves, I think it's so important. I remember when I moved away from back home, moved up to Belfast, started to actually meet people from all different religions, all different backgrounds, that there was a real moment where I had to sit and recognize that I was very biased in many ways, because I had been taught and brought up to be biased against certain communities. Now certainly, my father changed quite a lot as he got older and everything else, but he grew up in the war, and he was in the war, and he knows what that was like. So there's a huge balancing act here when we talk about challenging bias. A lot of us are maybe more comfortable now talking about challenging the bias of religion. We certainly see a lot of people speaking out against some of the rhetoric that politicians use here, and so on. What I would ask you to do is think about the same rhetoric that's being used about people of colour, about immigration, and so on as well, that we can't just rest on our laurels when it's something that we're comfortable challenging, that we recognise that there will always be someone that someone wants you to hate, and that you should always push back against that. I have to do this as well. Like I said, nobody's perfect, but being willing to challenge yourself, being willing to ask yourself why you make certain decisions is a key part of this. Sometimes it just takes a few seconds to think, why am I more drawn to this than that? Why do I not like that person? Am I actually being fair, or maybe they're just not nice? But thinking about actually why we do certain things. But what I would ask you to do as I sort of leave you before we have questions is listen. And yes, you're listening right now, which is great, hopefully, but really listen to the people around you. Spend some time reading books, reading articles online and so on, investing in recognizing different experiences. I think one of the things I really learned when I moved away from back home, moved to Belfast, moved to London, and then travelled all over the different places, but there are so many different experiences in the world that I would never know about if I just close my ears and put blinders on. I could very easily just live in a bubble that existed the same way as that I've always lived, that I've always grown up with, and so on. But who does that serve? That doesn't even help me be the best person that I can be, because it's so close-minded. I would ask you to think about how you support people. And Karen, I know you've mentioned sort of mentorship programs and so on like that here. I think that's so, so important when we think about how we nurture the next generation of talent. Remembering that we will not be here forever. There will be people that will be sitting in these chairs in whatever many years it is. There will be other people on these walls and so on at some stage too. What are we doing to help nurture those different people? What are we doing to help those people tap into their potential? What are we doing to also support ourselves in this as well? This work is not easy. We're having some very frank conversations, some things that are very eye-opening for people. You know, I talk about my experiences, some of those things that have happened to certainly me and my brother, and people are dumbfounded, they're exasperated, they can't believe that it's happened, whereas I'm like, I don't know how you can't believe that, because I grew up with that. I still get asked where I'm from and where I'm really from regularly, and I respond in a way that I wouldn't say when I'm being recorded. But I think, you know, it's very commonplace now. I'm very used to it. But so many people are only having that awakening now. What I would say to folks as well is that whilst that could be frustrating, certainly for people like me, where people are having an awakening, it's still really good that you're having that awakening. And again, nobody's perfect. At least now, if people are listening, we can move forward together. We will never fix things. We can never fix things that focus on marginalised folks with just those people. Everybody has to be involved here, whether that's around race equality, gender equality, disability access, and the combination of all of those different things. We need to have everybody involved in this, because that's the only way we can change things. I would ask you to self-reflect, you know, thinking about your own journey, thinking about the access to opportunities that you may have or you may not have, thinking about the people that you work with, what are their journeys like, thinking about the places, the research that you do, how you decide how funding is allocated and so on, really thinking about why you do certain things. And what I would say is to change as well. You know, we can all be better in some way, shape or form, whatever that might be. What I would say to you is that there's no point in listening and supporting and self-reflecting if we never change, because then it's very, very hollow, and people will see that. The main thing that we can do is be willing to change, to be willing to be wrong, to be willing to learn something different that we've maybe never experienced before, with the understanding that we potentially, fingers crossed, leave the world better than we found it. So like I said, my book, Demanding More, it's everywhere if you're interested. You can find that in lots of spaces, and it really delves into all of those conversations on race, on privilege, on particularly socioeconomic background and so on. But I am really excited to hopefully have some questions. Thank you.